Good evening, I'm Maciej Mikos and you're watching World News Tonight live from Warsaw. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk says a Russian shadow fleet vessel carried out suspicious maneuvers near an underwater power cable connecting Poland and Sweden. We'll have more on that in just a moment, but first let's take a look at tonight's headlines. Polish right-wing presidential candidate opposes Ukraine's NATO bid. Serbian president accuses the judiciary of criminal moves amidst the ongoing crackdown on opposition. And the EU is looking at reviewing its agreement with Israel over humanitarian concerns. Tensions mount in the Baltic Sea after a Russian shadow fleet vessel was spotted maneuvering next to underwater cables connecting Poland and Sweden. The incident took place only a day after the EU announced the 17th sanctions package against Russia, this time targeting its shadow fleet suspected of acts of sabotage on Western undersea infrastructure. Commenting on the incident, Polish Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski called the Baltic the most dangerous sea in the world. Franciszek Pilis reports.
As months go by, more and more disruptions linked to Russian vessels are being reported in the Baltic Sea.
A Russian ship from the so-called shadow fleet covered by sanctions was acting suspiciously near a power cable connecting Poland with Sweden. After an effective intervention from our military, the ship departed for a Russian port. The Polish vessel ORP Heweliusz is currently heading to the scene of the incident.
This time, like many times before, the target of the perceived sabotage were undersea cables.
The incident did not happen in Polish territorial waters, but took place just above undersea cables owned by Poland's state power transmission operator. Relevant officers immediately issued orders to follow pre-established procedures, including launching patrol flights and deterrence efforts.
The country's defense minister also said that the Polish Navy, as well as other defense forces, will convene for a meeting on Thursday at the Naval Operations Center in Gdynia's Polish Navy port, with Prime Minister Tusk in attendance, to discuss the security situation in the Baltic Sea. Despite a plethora of international sanctions, these ships continue to haul Russian energy products, namely oil, across seas to the farthest corners of the earth. This, however, doesn't discourage the EU from putting more limitations on these ships in their sanctions packages.
They include, for example, many more shadow fleet ships. If I remember correctly, it's 189. So a big number of ships being used by Russia to transport crude oil.
By making the ships uninsured and obscuring their ownership, as well as the origin of their cargo, Russia continues to export its oil abroad, safe from the gaze of meddlesome sanctions officers. Economic benefits are far from the only thing these rust-covered hunks of metal are used for by Russia, however, as they make for perfect saboteurs. Over the course of the last 3 years, since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the number of underwater infrastructure disruptions in the Baltic Sea linked to these vessels has become staggering. At least 6 sabotage cases have been reported since 2022. Since 2023, 11 undersea cables in the Baltic have been damaged.
The Baltic is currently the most dangerous sea in the world. Even if we assume that incidents of cable or pipeline breaks are accidents, there are still too many of them.
Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk said that these sorts of provocations from Russia will be met with decisive action from Poland and the whole of NATO, as the Baltic Sea is a key basin for the alliance's trade routes and eastern flank security. For TVP World, Franciszek Pilis.
While Europe introduces another round of sanctions on Moscow, US President Donald Trump refuses to put more pressure on Vladimir Putin to reach peace in Ukraine. The president's diplomatic efforts have been met with criticism in Ukraine as well as in the US Senate. Chief political correspondent Aaron Damon has this report.
For all the back and forth on a potential ceasefire in Ukraine, Kyiv remains on edge.
I do not see any advantages. All these calls are meaningless, all these talks. Ukraine has a weak position, very weak. Ukraine has not received anything yet, except that we will continue to talk. Talking to a person like Putin, he understands only the position of force.
Europe now trying to put the Kremlin in a bind by laying out sanctions specifically targeting Moscow's so-called shadow fleet. But across the Atlantic, US President Donald Trump, who held a phone call with Russian leader Vladimir Putin earlier this week, isn't rushing to a crackdown himself.
We'll see how Russia behaves. We see what's going to happen.
In fact, Trump's latest gambit has been another threat of a total walkout if peace doesn't materialize. His Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, forced to defend the president's corner in a heated Senate exchange, saying the US is waiting for Russia to deliver terms for a deal.
Russia wants what they do not currently have and are not entitled to, and Ukraine wants what they cannot regain militarily. And that's been the crux of the challenge.
I don't disagree with that at one level, but on the other hand, what Vladimir Putin is doing now is playing for time, and he's playing this president like a fiddle.
Well, I disagree with this playing with a fiddle analogy, because the truth of the matter is when Vladimir Putin woke up this morning, he had the same set of sanctions on him that he's always had since the beginning of this conflict. And he hasn't gotten a single sanction lifted.
But it's not only in the Senate where concerns are growing that Putin is playing Trump for time.
That's exactly what Putin wants. He just wanted to win the time, and he won the time, and he continues the war, he continues killing, and what is the reaction of the United States? There is no.
European leaders and lawmakers are urging Trump to pile the pressure on Putin, even as the Kremlin denies any hold-up. On Wednesday, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky spoke with Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk, who posted on social media that the commitment of the US is key in the peace process.
And I hope that sooner or later, the United States will recognize the clear fact that either they will impose really serious sanctions on Russia, or Russia will continue this war or another war, and will continue also to threaten United States' national security interest.
Reports suggest Ukraine will ask the EU next week to further step up its efforts to isolate Moscow, including seizing Russian assets. A bill is also currently sitting in the US Senate waiting to be voted on, introduced by pro-Ukrainian Republican Lindsey Graham, which would slam a 500% tariff on imports from countries that purchase Russian oil and gas.
Ukraine has European support and still has American support. And in the background there is a package of very hard sanctions signed by almost 80 senators.
Graham was expected to brief NATO leaders on the legislation last week and says he has the bipartisan votes in Congress to pass it. But Trump has not made it clear if or when he would be prepared to endorse the proposed package. With the Vatican shaping up as a possible new home for peace negotiations, Ukraine and Europe are trying to keep the faith. Aaron Darman, TVP World.
And now on to the Polish presidential elections. Conservative candidate Karol Nawrocki says he won't ratify Ukraine's accession into NATO under any circumstances, and are not far-right voters ahead of the second round of voting. This comes in stark contrast to the position of centrist candidate Rafał Trzaskowski from the ruling coalition, winner of the first round of elections. Kazimierz Łysiak reports.
Warsaw Mayor Rafał Trzaskowski or historian Karol Nawrocki. One of them will be the next president of Poland after a final face-off on the 1st of June. Neither candidate received the 50% needed to claim victory in the first round of voting, instead sitting neck and neck around 30% each. Now the fight is on to court voters of third-place runner-up, the far-right Sławomir Mencen. After receiving 15% of the vote, he's setting the terms.
I'm inviting both candidates to talk with me on my YouTube channel so my voters can get to know them better. I will also give them a printed declaration with some of the issues which are crucial to my voters. I hope they sign it.
Mencen's declaration consists of 8 points, which include no new taxes or regulations limiting freedom of expression, But some of the biggest controversy surrounds the points on Poland's foreign policy, like refusing to ratify Ukraine's future NATO membership or giving new competencies to the European Union. For the ruling coalition's pro-EU, pro-NATO candidate Rafał Trzaskowski, some of these points go against everything he stands for.
Sławomir, I can't guarantee that I will sign anything, but I can promise a nice and civil conversation. I'm sure we can find common ground on plenty of issues, but there are some where it's just impossible.
But conservative Karol Nawrocki, backed by the Law and Justice opposition party, wasted no time in doubling down on the far-right rhetoric.
I accept the invitation. I'm ready to sign these proposals. We will discuss the rest on your channel.
Nawrocki's readiness to sign the declaration represents a shift in his rhetoric, as he previously conditioned Ukraine's NATO membership on issues like the exhumations of Polish World War II victims killed by Ukrainian nationalists.
Karol Nawrocki said, I would sign it, no problem, because he would do obviously anything he can to get the presidentship, while Rafał Trzaskowski is absolutely unable to sign it because that would mean basically pointing himself against the European Union, against Ukraine.
The exhumations of these Polish World War II victims have already begun, following negotiations between Warsaw and Kyiv. But this hasn't stopped Nawrocki from aligning himself with anti-Ukrainian Mensen. This hasn't gone unnoticed to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky.
I spoke with Prime Minister of Poland, Donald Tusk, about the presidential elections, next steps towards peace, and the opening of negotiation clusters in Ukraine's EU accession process. It's important that Poland remains a reliable partner and friend.
Ukraine's NATO membership is something US President Donald Trump has taken off the table as a nod to Russia in the ongoing peace process, something Kyiv and its Western allies are not too happy with.
We're trying to solve a problem.
It is a somewhat surprising and unhelpful concession to give to Russia right away that sort of gift. And it's a concession that I believe only emboldens Putin.
As the second round of voting is fast approaching, the battle between Rafał Trzaskowski and Karol Nawrocki is becoming increasingly about working with or against the European Union and Ukraine. For TVP World, I'm Kazimierz Łysiak.
Poland's Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski says a great majority of NATO members want Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to be invited to the alliance's upcoming summit at The Hague. The top diplomat's support for Kyiv comes on the back of various media reports suggesting that US President Donald Trump wants to sideline Zelensky at the meeting, a claim denied by the White House. And so, we are joined now live by our EU correspondent Angela Skujins in Brussels. Good evening, Angela. Do Minister Sikorski's comments today mean that Zelensky's invitation is guaranteed for the summit next month in the Netherlands?
Yes, so this is an excellent question. While these are optimistic overtures from Poland's top diplomat, the procedure remains that any non-NATO member that attends a summit such as this kind needs to have the backing of all of those 32 alliance members. They also requires an invitation extended by the Secretary General. In this case, it would be Mark Rutte. This has not been formally offered just yet, but the clock is ticking with that summit scheduled for the 24th and 26th of June in the Netherlands. But if we look at the previous year's estimates, the then Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg offered this invitation to Zelensky roughly 2 months before that summit kicked off in Washington. But this would be Zelensky's third summit if he was successfully invited. Also, Ukraine formally lodged its application to join NATO in 2022 since Russia's full-scale invasion. So Zelensky's attendance here is really important. It demonstrates an opportunity for him to accelerate these accession negotiations. Let's take a listen to what Minister Sikorski had to say regarding the status of his invite.
We had a discussion on this at the informal NATO ministerial in Antalya in Turkey. and the great majority of member states spoke up in favor of inviting President Zelensky.
But these warm words shared by Minister Sikorski really run counter to media reports that suggest that US President Donald Trump wants to sideline Zelensky at this summit and potentially not invite him. This has been refuted by the White House, particularly US Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who said that it is not any intention for Washington to exclude Ukraine from these talks. But NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte was pressed by a journalist today in Brussels regarding whether any of this summit has been curtailed to appease to the whims of the 47th President of the United States. Let's take a listen to what Rutte had to say regarding the outline for those 2 days.
I want us to spend more, I want us to produce more. And when it comes to Ukraine, this will also be a subject at the summit. We have to make sure that Ukraine, as long as the fight is there, that we collectively do everything possible to make sure they are in the best possible position to continue that fight. And when peace comes, that it will be a ceasefire / a peace deal which is lasting, which is enduring, that we will never get back to a repeat of what we saw with the Minsk agreement.
Yes, so what is demonstrably clear is that both Mr. Sikorski and Rutte could not respond to these questions with a yes or no answer. And while that invite list is shrouded in secrecy for now, we know that agenda for those upcoming 2 days will mostly centre on scaling up defence spending targets to at least 3%. That is what Rutte foreshadowed today, to make sure there's also enough strategic autonomy so that if a country like Russia were to attack any of those 32 allies, that they would have enough of that industrial base to support them and the ramp up of manufacturing. They will also discuss Baltic security, as we've just heard at the top of this bulletin, those hybrid threats occurring, those potential cable cuts as well. And so while we wait for that invite to potentially materialise for Zelensky, we hope that his RSVP will still be a yes. But that's all from me in Brussels. I'll send it back to you in Warsaw.
That was Angela Skujins reporting from Brussels. Thank you very much, Angela. After several months in custody, 3 Serbian anti-government protesters accused of plotting a coup d'etat have been transferred to home arrest. According to Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić, the accused are terrorists and part of the country's judicial system supports the color revolution. Paweł Trzaskowski reports on the latest from Serbia.
Terrorists. This is how Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić called the protesters who were eventually released from custody by the Novi Sad Court of Appeal and placed under house arrest, a move that followed a days-long protest staged in front of the court.
What matters most to me is to be here and support people who have been in prison for 3 months now over evidence that wasn't even properly obtained.
The arrested protesters were held in custody on suspicion of crimes against constitutional order in the country, but their release, instead of calming tensions, was used to fuel more attacks from the authorities, including former Prime Minister Miloš Vučević.
The extremists were released from custody because the protesters had been putting pressure on the judiciary and prosecutor's office for days.
And these critical messages add to the confrontational stance of the current government toward the protesters, a stance that, after a period of leniency, has intensified and might be aimed at provoking violent responses.
So the question is to which extent actually the government will also provoke the citizens to go further in expressing their discontent.
As anti-government demonstrations have been continuing in Serbia for more than half a year now, the authorities have recently started staging pro-government rallies.
We want students to stop blockades. Let there be peace and a safe and better Serbia.
And the country's president accused the protesters of organizing a color revolution.
There is no victory of the color revolution. There is victory of an honest Serbia.
Therefore, tensions in Serbia are intensifying. The protesters, who initially demanded accountability for those responsible for the Novi Sad roof collapse that killed 16 people, are now pushing for more.
To call for the anticipated parliamentary elections.
Protesters say the elections should be organized by the end of June. However, for now the government is refusing to hold them. And as the European Union still seems willing to talk to the country's leadership, with European Council President visiting Belgrade last week and the bloc's foreign affairs representative starting her visit this Wednesday, the current government doesn't feel the international pressure to bow down to the protesters' demands. Paweł Trzaskowski for TVP World.
The EU is working on reviewing its agreement with Israel due to the, quote, catastrophic situation in Gaza, the bloc's top diplomat Kaja Kallas has said. Israel has already rejected Kallas' statement, and the motion is also facing strong opposition within the EU itself, as 10 member states have a different opinion. Zuzanna Jurek reports.
The decision was announced by the EU's foreign policy chief Kaja Kallas on the sidelines of the meeting with the foreign ministers of the 27 member states in Brussels.
It is clear from today's discussion that there is a strong majority in favor of review of Article 2 of our association agreement with Israel. And in the meantime, it is up to Israel to unblock the humanitarian aid. Saving lives must be our top priority.
The initiative came from the Netherlands and is backed by 17 member states, Estonia, Poland and Slovakia amongst them. The Czech Republic, Germany and Lithuania opposed, while Latvia was neutral, media sources reported. Israel's foreign ministry spokesperson Oren Marmoshtein rebuked the bloc's decision on social media. Momentum to re-examine the 1995 EU-Israel Association Agreement, which forms the basis for trade ties, has grown since Israel resumed its military offensive on Gaza after the ceasefire expired.
This agreement has an article number 2, which refers to that the party to this agreement with the EU has to act in line with several things, among them being human rights.
They are putting more pressure on Netanyahu to stop this war, and also to end this blockade that have started 2 months ago. Blockade on aid from entering Gaza and food and so on. As we have seen now, it's a kind of starvation.
Poland, which was amongst the 17 countries in favor of the re-examination of the association agreement, previously leveraged criticism of the country.
We'd like to remind Israel that as the occupying power of both the West Bank and of the Gaza Strip, it is Israel that is responsible for the welfare of the people who live there.
The EU's collective criticism follows a joint statement by the British, French and Canadian heads of government rebuking the Israeli government's intensified campaign. However, not all member states of the bloc shared the criticism. The initiative was blocked by the EU's well-known dissenter, Hungary. Budapest also blocked the proposed EU sanctions on the Israeli settlers in the West Bank.
There's a very strong political, philosophical political alignment between Bibi Netanyahu and Prime Minister Orban. Hungary has supported Israel on I think most, if not all, occasions when it came to votes in the European Council.
Though the EU has struggled to have an impact on the conflict, as there are long-standing divisions between countries who back Israel and those who consider it more pro-Palestinian, the 11-week blockade on the entry of aid seems to have triggered a shift in the thinking amongst the member states. For TVP World, Zuzanna Jurek.
The Baltic is currently the most dangerous sea in the world, believes Polish Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski. His statement comes on the heels of a suspicious incident which took place on Wednesday as a Russian Shadow Fleet ship was spotted maneuvering in the proximity of a power cable connecting Poland and Sweden. As the tensions grow in the north, war-torn Ukraine seeks to secure its place at the next NATO summit, The Hague. To discuss it, we're joined by our very own Marcin Zaborowski, head of the Europe section at TVP World.
Hello, Marcin.
Good evening, Marcin. So, first of all, about the incident in the Baltic Sea, do we know anything more about it? Has any damage been done?
We know that not much damage has been, actually no damage has been done, other than in communication and in the perception of security. But that suspicious Russian Shadow Fleet ship, just appeared, was engaged in suspicious activities, and the Polish Navy reacted quite swiftly. So it was chased off, basically, and returned to its harbor.
Right, so maybe no damage has been done because of the swift action of Polish Navy. But the question is whether Russians will attempt to do it more often, whether they will test, Polish and other states' reaction time.
Well, I think we live in a very uncertain time, but we can be certain that the Russians will continue to do that. Clearly now being in a condition in which the Baltic Sea is the area where they lost their superiority, they have only access to one harbor at this point in time, is deeply uncomfortable for them, where the Baltic Sea is almost like a NATO lake at this point in time after Sweden and Finland joined the alliance. Since the war started, war against the Ukraine, the incidents of the Baltic Sea have increased tenfold. And even us, ourselves, we reported that about a half a year ago, there was a suspicious Russian activity on the Baltic pipeline, which connects Poland with Norway. That report was denied by the Polish armed forces. But it's clear that this is a very dangerous part of the world at this point in time.
Now, only yesterday, the EU has announced new sanctions package against Russia, the 17th already. This time targeting its Shadow Fleet. Now, how painful is it for Russia, and if the US want to do the same? I mean, can Europe alone break the Russia's war machine?
Probably not. What Europe has done by reducing very substantially the imports of Russian gas and oil has been very painful for Russia, but they found the way out, and that's the way out they found thanks to the Shadow Fleet. Meaning basically the export of re-export of the commodities to China, India, Brazil, other parts of the world, which we call Global South, which very willingly buys now the Russian commodities, which are at discounted price. So they have a market, and they are feeling successful with the gap that the Europeans have left there, and that's why targeting the Shadow Fleet, which is, the means through which they actually are engaged in this trade, is so important and so essential. And that's why working together with the United States on that would be the most important element of that.
Let's talk about NATO now. Donald Trump opposes more sanctions to be imposed on Russia. Donald Trump opposes Ukraine joining NATO. Do you also think that Donald Trump opposes Volodymyr Zelensky's attendance at the next NATO summit, The Hague?
Well, my understanding also from your feature is that that is unclear, really, at this point in time. What we know is that these are rumors within the media community that the Americans are not committing and they are pushing against inviting President Zelensky and Russian delegation to The Hague. But
Ukrainian delegation.
The Ukrainian delegation to The Hague. But that's unconfirmed. And Marco Rubio said that he doesn't know where these rumors are coming from. But at the same time, it would be very easy just to say we are in favor and we would want to have Mr. Zelensky in The Hague. He didn't say that. So it suggests that something is going on there, indeed, which would be a huge coup for Russia, because the last NATO summit in Washington was so much dedicated to Ukraine, with President Zelensky being there, with Mr. Yarmak being on stage, with very strong decisions, with the communication which says that that Ukraine is on the irreversible path to NATO membership, and also material decisions, with the setting up of headquarters in Wiesbaden dedicated specifically to ease Ukraine's application to join NATO.
Right. Now, the issue of Ukraine joining NATO has also become a hot topic of the Polish presidential campaign. What do you make of Karol Nawrocki, the right-wing candidate's statement that he would never ratify Ukraine's access to NATO?
Well, that is just sad, to be honest, because in this country we used to have a consensus. When it comes to Ukraine, when it comes to relations with Russia, we used to have a consensus over basically supporting Ukraine because it's in our national interest to have a strong country between ourselves and Russia.
But the far right, which Karol Nawrocki wants to court, thinks otherwise.
Indeed, but let's just also remind ourselves that both the outgoing president Andrzej Duda and the other president from this camp, Lech Kaczynski, were very strong in favor of Ukraine joining NATO. So now Karol Nawrocki coming in and saying, I will sign a declaration, never Ukraine in NATO, is really basically playing in the Russian corner. And as such, it's sad, frankly.
Marcin Zaborowski, Europe editor at TVP World, was our guest tonight. Marcin, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching and stay with us for much more news and features here on TVP World.